The crystal chandeliers cast their golden light across the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, where 300 of the city's most influential figures had gathered for what would be remembered as the night everything changed. The orchestra played Vivaldi with practiced precision, their notes floating above the murmur of conversations conducted in hushed, important tones. Men in $1,000 tuxedos and women draped in designer gowns moved through the space like pieces on a chessboard, each calculated step designed to advance their position in the intricate game of power and prestige. At the center of it all stood Richard Morrison, CEO of Morrison Industries, a man whose empire stretched across 3 continents and whose word could shift markets with a single phone call. Tonight was his night, a celebration of the company's record-breaking year, a testament to his vision and ruthless business acumen. He should have been basking in the adulation, accepting the congratulations of his peers, reveling in the success that had taken him 30 years to build. Instead, his eyes kept drifting to the far corner of the ballroom, where shadows gathered between the towering marble columns. There, barely visible in the dim light, sat Emily Morrison, his daughter, his only child, his greatest joy and deepest heartbreak, all wrapped into one 22-year-old woman, whose life had been forever altered on a rain-soaked highway 3 years ago. Emily sat in her wheelchair, a vision of ethereal beauty that seemed almost ghost-like against the opulent backdrop. Her auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders in careful waves, and her emerald dress, chosen specifically to bring out the color of her eyes, clung perfectly to her slender frame. She was, by any objective measure, stunning. Yet she might as well have been invisible for all the attention she received from the glittering crowd that surrounded her. The whispers had started early in the evening, carried on the wind of champagne-loosened tongues and cruel curiosity. They thought they were being discreet, these pillars of society, these titans of industry who prided themselves on their refinement and class. "Such a shame about Richard's daughter," murmured Margaret Whitfield, wife of the city's most prominent attorney, her lips barely moving as she spoke behind her champagne flute. "She was quite the beauty before the accident." "Beautiful, yes. But what good does that do her now?" replied Victoria Sterling, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "No man wants damaged goods, no matter how pretty the package." "I heard she hasn't left the house in months," chimed in another voice, one of many that would blend together in Emily's memory as a chorus of casual cruelty. "Richard spends a fortune on therapists, but what's the point? She'll never walk again, never dance, never have a normal life. Such a burden for a man in his position." Each word was a dagger, carefully sharpened and precisely aimed. Emily heard every single one, though she gave no outward sign of the pain they caused. She had learned to school her features into a mask of serene indifference, to let the words wash over her like rain on stone. But inside, each comment carved away another piece of her already fragile self-worth. She watched as young men her age, sons of her father's business associates, heirs to vast fortunes, looked right through her as if she were made of glass. She observed as conversations died when she wheeled closer, as people suddenly remembered pressing engagements elsewhere when she attempted to join their circles. The dance floor, that glittering expanse of polished marble that had once called to her like a siren's song, now seemed as distant and unreachable as the surface of the moon. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 years ago, she had been the darling of society, the girl everyone wanted to know, to be seen with, to court. Princeton graduate, accomplished pianist, fluent in 4 languages, and blessed with a combination of intelligence and beauty that had made her the envy of her peers. Suitors had lined up for the privilege of taking her to dinner, and invitations to every important social event had flooded their mailbox. All of that had ended in the space of 3 seconds on Interstate 95, when a drunk driver had run a red light and changed the trajectory of her life forever. The accident had taken her legs, but it had stolen something far more precious: her place in the world, her identity, her future as she had imagined it. Now she was a cautionary tale, a tragic figure to be pitied and then forgotten. She was living proof that fortune could change in an instant, a reminder that made people uncomfortable in its proximity. Better to look away, to pretend she wasn't there, to treat her like an unfortunate piece of furniture that someone had forgotten to move to storage. As the evening wore on, the cruelty became more brazen. A group of young socialites, emboldened by cocktails and the pack mentality that seemed to infect gatherings like this, had positioned themselves near Emily's corner. They spoke just loudly enough for her to hear, their voices carrying the particular brand of viciousness that only comes from those who have never known real hardship. "Can you imagine being trapped like that?" Melissa Crawford said, gesturing in Emily's direction with the casual indifference one might show when pointing out a piece of art. "I mean, what's the point? She'll never have a career, never travel, never experience the things that make life worth living. The worst part is how she just sits there," added Jennifer Walsh, daughter of a pharmaceutical fortune and someone Emily had once considered a friend. Like she's waiting for someone to rescue her. It's almost pathetic. Who would want to rescue her, though? The third voice belonged to Patricia Hoffman, whose family controlled half the city's real estate. What man in his right mind would saddle himself with that kind of responsibility? She's lovely to look at, I'll give her that, but beauty fades. Disability is forever. The words hit Emily like physical blows, each one landing with surgical precision in the places where she was most vulnerable. She felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack, felt the familiar burn of tears threatening behind her eyes. She wanted to wheel away, to retreat to the safety of her father's study or the sanctuary of her bedroom, but something kept her frozen in place. Perhaps it was pride, or perhaps it was the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might prove these heartless people wrong. Her father, meanwhile, stood across the room accepting congratulations and making small talk about market trends and quarterly projections, all while watching his daughter from the corner of his eye. Richard Morrison was a man who had built an empire through shrewd calculation and an ability to read people like open books, yet he found himself powerless in the face of his daughter's suffering. He saw the way she held herself, the carefully neutral expression that he recognized as a defense mechanism learned through bitter experience. He witnessed the cruel whispers, and felt his own heart breaking with each careless comment. He had tried everything money could buy, the best doctors, the most advanced treatments, therapists who specialized in spinal cord injuries, and the psychological trauma that accompanied them. But he couldn't buy her acceptance, couldn't purchase a place for her in a world that seemed determined to cast her aside. The business world that had been so easily conquered proved useless when it came to healing his daughter's wounded spirit. Tonight was supposed to be different. He had insisted she come, had personally assured her that she belonged here, that she was an important part of his success, and deserved to share in the celebration. But as he watched her sitting alone in that corner, ignored and dismissed by people who should have known better, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. The orchestra had been playing for over an hour, when Marcus Thompson arrived with his 8-year-old daughter Sophie in tow. Marcus wasn't supposed to be at the party, at least, not as a guest. He worked for the catering company that had been hired to handle the evening service, and under normal circumstances, he would have been in the kitchen or moving quietly among the tables, invisible to the wealthy patrons who barely registered the existence of the people who served them. But tonight was different. Marcus's regular babysitter had canceled at the last minute, and he couldn't afford to miss the work. The overtime pay from an event like this would cover Sophie's school supplies for the entire semester. So he had struck a deal with his supervisor. Bring Sophie along, keep her quiet and out of the way, and he could work the event. It wasn't ideal, but it was the kind of compromise that single fathers learned to make when survival depended on flexibility. Marcus Thompson was not a man who attracted attention in rooms like this. At 34, he possessed a quiet strength that came from years of shouldering responsibility alone. His tuxedo was rented, not tailored, and his shoes were polished, but well worn. He had calloused hands and laugh lines around his eyes, evidence of a life lived without the cushion of inherited wealth or easy privilege. He was, in every sense of the word, ordinary, which in a room full of extraordinary egos made him nearly invisible. Sophie, however, was anything but ordinary. She was 8 years old and possessed the kind of fearless curiosity that hadn't yet been tempered by social expectations. She had wide brown eyes that seemed to take in everything, a gap-toothed smile that could melt the hardest heart, and an absolute inability to understand why adults made such a big deal about things like money and status. While Marcus worked, Sophie was supposed to sit quietly in the service area with a book and her coloring supplies. But the music and the lights and the general air of celebration proved too tempting for a child who had spent most of her life in much simpler surroundings. When her father wasn't looking, she slipped away from her assigned spot and began to explore. That's how she found Emily. Sophie had been drawn by the wheelchair, which struck her as the most interesting thing in a room full of boring adult furniture. She approached with the directness that only children possess, walking right up to Emily and staring at her with frank curiosity. "Why are you sitting in that chair?" Sophie asked, her head tilted to one side like a curious puppy. Emily looked down at the child, momentarily startled by the unexpected interaction. She was used to stares, but they were usually accompanied by pity or disgust, not this kind of innocent interest. "I can't walk," Emily said simply, unsure how to explain the complexities of her situation to an 8-year-old. Sophie nodded as if this made perfect sense. "My friend Tommy at school can't walk either. He has a chair like yours, but his is blue. Yours is prettier." The simplicity of the statement, the complete absence of judgment or pity, caught Emily off guard. She felt something loosening in her chest, some tightly held knot of tension beginning to unravel. "What's your name?" Sophie asked, apparently satisfied with the walking explanation. "Emily." "What's yours?" "Sophie. My daddy's working here tonight. He said I have to be quiet, and not bother the fancy people, but you don't seem fancy. You seem sad. The observation, delivered with the brutal honesty that children excel at, hit Emily more deeply than all the cruel whispers combined. Here was someone who saw her, really saw her, not as an object of pity or a social liability, but simply as a person who was sad. I am a little sad, Emily admitted, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Why? Sophie asked, settling cross-legged on the floor next to Emily's wheelchair as if she had all the time in the world. It was such a simple question, yet Emily found herself struggling to answer it. How could she explain to this child that she was sad because the world had decided she no longer mattered? That she was sad because she had lost not just the use of her legs, but her place in society, her sense of purpose, her belief in her own worth? Before she could formulate an answer, Marcus appeared, having finally noticed his daughter's absence from her designated spot. He approached quickly, his face flushed with embarrassment and concern. Sophie, what have I told you about wandering off? He said, his voice gentle but firm. Then, looking up at Emily, his expression shifted to one of apologetic concern. I'm so sorry, miss. I hope she wasn't bothering you. Emily looked at this man, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere to rescue his daughter, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. He was looking at her directly, speaking to her as if she were a normal person rather than an object of pity. His eyes held no trace of the uncomfortable sympathy she had grown accustomed to, no hint of the relief people usually showed when they realized they could escape her presence. She wasn't bothering me at all, Emily said, and meant it. We were just talking. Sophie has a gift for making friends wherever she goes, Marcus said, and Emily could hear the pride in his voice. Sometimes it gets her into trouble, but mostly it's a good thing. I like Emily, Sophie announced, as if her approval settled the matter once and for all. She's pretty and she's sad, but I think she's nice. Marcus looked more closely at Emily then, and she saw the moment when recognition dawned. She was used to this, the sudden realization of who she was, followed by the inevitable awkwardness, as people tried to figure out how to treat the daughter of Richard Morrison. But Marcus surprised her. Instead of becoming flustered or obsequious, he simply said, "It's nice to meet you, Emily. I'm Marcus Thompson." There was something in the way he said it, not Marcus Thompson from the catering company or Marcus Thompson, excuse me for presuming, just his name, offered with the same straightforward simplicity his daughter had shown. It was refreshing in a way that Emily hadn't expected. They talked for several minutes, with Sophie providing most of the conversation, while Marcus listened and occasionally contributed. Emily found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months, enjoying the simple pleasure of human connection without agenda or pity. Marcus treated her like a person first, not a disability with a person attached, and that made all the difference. When Marcus finally had to return to work, Sophie made him promise they could come back and visit Emily later. He agreed, shooting Emily an apologetic look that she waved away with a smile. The first genuine smile she had worn all evening. As they walked away, Emily felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. For just a few minutes, she had felt normal. She had felt seen and valued, not for her father's money or her tragic circumstances, but simply for herself. It was a small thing, perhaps, but to someone who had been starved of genuine human connection, it felt like a miracle. The evening continued around her, but Emily found herself watching Marcus as he moved through the room, carrying trays and clearing tables with efficient grace. She noticed the way he smiled at everyone he encountered, the same warm expression he had offered her. She saw how other staff members gravitated toward him, clearly drawn to his quiet confidence and natural kindness. And she watched Sophie, who had returned to her designated spot but kept waving at Emily whenever she caught her eye. It was during one of these stolen glances that the impossible happened. The orchestra had just finished a particularly rousing piece, and couples were beginning to migrate toward the dance floor for the evening's first formal dances. Emily watched with the detached interest of someone observing a foreign ritual, knowing that this was yet another experience that would forever be beyond her reach. She was so absorbed in her observation that she didn't notice Marcus approaching until he was standing directly beside her wheelchair. He had removed his service apron and straightened his rented tuxedo, and there was something in his posture that suggested he had made some kind of decision. "Emily," he said, his voice quiet but clear enough to carry over the surrounding chatter. She looked up at him, startled by the serious expression on his face. "Would you like to dance?" The question hung in the air between them, so unexpected and impossible that for a moment Emily thought she had misheard. Around them, conversations faltered as people began to register what was happening. The idea was so absurd, so completely outside the realm of possibility, that it took several seconds for the full impact to sink in. Emily stared at Marcus, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke, some elaborate prank designed to humiliate her even further. But she found only sincerity in his eyes, a gentle determination that suggested he was completely serious about his impossible offer. I can't dance," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing murmur of the crowd. "Neither can I, really," Marcus replied with a slight smile. "But I thought maybe we could figure it out together." The whispers were growing louder now, a rising tide of shocked commentary as the improbable scene unfolded. Someone behind Emily let out a small, cruel laugh. Someone else made a comment about the help forgetting their place. The attention she had been desperately avoiding all evening was suddenly focused on her, with laser intensity, and she felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that made her want to disappear entirely. "This is ridiculous," came a voice from nearby. Patricia Hoffman again, her tone dripping with disdain. "What kind of sick joke is this?" "Someone should put a stop to this," agreed another voice. "It's embarrassing for everyone involved." Emily felt her face burning with shame and humiliation. This was exactly what she had feared, exactly why she had spent the evening trying to remain invisible. Now she was the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. The object of cruel speculation and mockery. She started to wheel backward, to retreat to the safety of the shadows, but Marcus stepped slightly closer, his presence somehow managing to shield her from the worst of the stares. "You don't have to," he said quietly, speaking only to her despite the growing audience. "But if you want to, I'd be honored to be your partner." There was something in his voice, a combination of respect and genuine desire, that cut through the noise of the crowd and spoke directly to the part of Emily that had been buried under 3 years of rejection and isolation. Here was someone offering her not pity or charity, but the simple gift of being treated like a woman worthy of dancing with. She looked at his extended hand, then up at his face, then out at the crowd of people who were watching this impossible moment unfold. She thought about all the times she had been ignored, dismissed, or treated like a broken thing to be pitied. She thought about the cruel words that had been spoken about her tonight and every night before this one. She thought about the future that stretched ahead of her, empty of moments like this one. And then she thought about Sophie, sitting somewhere in the shadows, watching this unfold with the innocent belief that anything was possible if people were just kind to each other. "Yes," Emily said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, I would like to dance." The reaction was immediate and intense. Gasps of surprise mixed with sounds of derision. Someone muttered something about a spectacle, while another voice wondered aloud if security should intervene. The disapproval was palpable, a tangible force that seemed to press against them from all sides. But Marcus ignored it all. He moved to the side of Emily's wheelchair, and offered her his arm with the same formal courtesy he might have shown any lady at any dance. Emily placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him through the fabric of his jacket, and allowed him to guide her wheelchair toward the dance floor. The crowd parted before them like water, people stepping aside with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. Emily could hear the whispers growing louder, could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, but for the first time in years, she didn't care. She was done hiding, done allowing other people's discomfort to dictate her choices. When they reached the center of the dance floor, Marcus signaled to the orchestra leader, who looked confused but nodded his understanding. The musicians, perhaps sensing the importance of the moment, began to play a slow, gentle waltz, something soft and romantic that seemed to wrap around them like a cocoon. Marcus positioned himself beside Emily's wheelchair, taking her hand in his and placing his other hand gently on her shoulder. It wasn't traditional dancing, not the kind that anyone in this room would recognize or approve of, but it was theirs. They moved together in a gentle swaying motion, her chair rolling slowly in small circles as he guided their movement with careful precision. Emily had forgotten what it felt like to be held, to be touched with tenderness rather than medical necessity. Marcus's hand was warm and steady, his presence solid and reassuring, in a way that made her feel safe for the first time in years. She could smell his cologne, something simple and clean that suited him perfectly, and feel the slight nervousness in his movements that told her this was as new and strange for him as it was for her. "You're beautiful," he said quietly, his words meant only for her, despite the hundreds of people watching their every move. Emily felt tears spring to her eyes, but for once they weren't tears of sadness or frustration. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of something that felt dangerously close to joy. "Thank you," she whispered back, and meant it more deeply than she had ever meant anything in her life. They continued to move together, lost in their own private world despite the very public nature of their dance. The orchestra seemed to understand the importance of the moment, stretching the song longer than usual, giving them time to find their rhythm and settle into the strange magic of what they were creating together. Gradually, impossibly, the mood in the room began to shift. The initial shock and disapproval were giving way to something else. A recognition, perhaps, of the courage it had taken for both of them to step onto that dance floor. Some of the crueler voices fell silent, replaced by a thoughtful quiet that suggested people were actually seeing what was happening rather than simply reacting to it. But not everyone was moved to kindness. "This is absolutely ridiculous," came a loud voice from the edge of the dance floor. The speaker was Jonathan Blackwood, heir to a shipping fortune and someone who had never learned to moderate his opinions in the interest of social grace. "What kind of circus are we running here?" The words cut through the music like a knife, shattering the delicate spell that had been settling over the room. Emily felt Marcus's hand tighten slightly on hers, felt him make a small movement as if to shield her from the verbal assault. "I mean, really," Blackwood continued, apparently emboldened by the attention he was receiving. "Are we supposed to pretend this is normal? Are we supposed to applaud this pathetic display of, what? Charity? It's embarrassing for everyone involved." Other voices began to join in, the cruel energy that had been temporarily suppressed now finding an outlet in Blackwood's leadership. Comments about inappropriate behavior, about knowing one's place, about the degradation of standards floated through the air like poison gas. Emily felt her brief moment of happiness crumbling around her. The familiar shame was rushing back, flooding her system with the toxic certainty that she didn't belong here, that she had been foolish to believe otherwise. She started to pull away from Marcus, to retreat back to her corner where she could nurse her wounds in private. But Marcus wouldn't let her go. "Don't," he said firmly. His voice low but carrying enough authority to cut through her panic. "Don't let them win." She looked up at him, and saw something in his eyes that she had never seen directed at her before, not pity, not charity, but genuine anger on her behalf. He was furious at these people, furious at their cruelty, furious at a world that would try to crush something beautiful simply because it didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. "They don't get to decide your worth," Marcus said, his words fierce despite their quiet delivery. "They don't get to tell you what you can and cannot do. They don't get to make you disappear." The power in his words, the absolute conviction behind them, sent a shock of electricity through Emily's entire being. Here was someone who was willing to fight for her, who saw her as worth defending. The realization was almost overwhelming. But before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension, one that made everyone in the room freeze. "That's enough." Richard Morrison's voice carried the kind of authority that comes from 3 decades of commanding boardrooms and closing deals worth billions of dollars. He had been watching from the sidelines, torn between his instinct to protect his daughter and his uncertainty about how to handle such an unprecedented situation. But Blackwood's cruel words had finally pushed him past his breaking point. He strode onto the dance floor, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone in the room. When Richard Morrison spoke, people listened, not just because of his wealth or position, but because he possessed the kind of natural leadership that couldn't be bought or inherited. "Jonathan," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I think you've had too much to drink." Blackwood, suddenly realizing he had crossed a line he hadn't intended to cross, began to stammer some kind of apology or explanation. But Richard wasn't interested in hearing it. "In fact," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger, "I think several of you have forgotten yourselves tonight. You've forgotten that you're guests in my home, celebrating my success, enjoying my hospitality. And you've forgotten that the young woman you've been so eager to dismiss and mock is my daughter." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in that room understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Richard Morrison, the consummate businessman who never allowed emotion to interfere with strategy, was taking a public stand that would have social and professional ramifications for years to come. "Emily is not a burden," Richard said, his eyes sweeping the crowd with laser intensity. "She is not damaged goods. She is not a tragedy or a cautionary tale. She is my daughter, and she is the strongest, most courageous person I know. She has faced challenges that would have broken most of you, and she has done so with more grace and dignity than any of you have shown tonight." Emily stared at her father in amazement. In 3 years, she had never heard him speak about her accident or her disability with anything other than careful neutrality. She had assumed his silence meant embarrassment, that her condition was something he preferred not to acknowledge. To hear him defend her so publicly, so passionately, was almost more than she could process. "And this man," Richard continued, turning his attention to Marcus, "this man who you've been so quick to dismiss, because he doesn't have the right pedigree or the right bank account. This man has shown more class and courage tonight than the rest of you combined. He saw a beautiful woman who deserved to dance, and he had the decency to ask her. The fact that most of you couldn't see past a wheelchair to recognize that same beauty says everything about you and nothing about her." The crowd was utterly silent now, hundreds of the city's most powerful people absorbing a lecture that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Some looked ashamed, others defiant, but all of them understood that something fundamental had shifted in the room. Richard walked over to where Marcus and Emily sat, still positioned as they had been when the music stopped. He extended his hand to Marcus, who took it after only a moment's hesitation. "Thank you," Richard said simply. "Thank you for seeing what I should have helped everyone else see long ago." Marcus nodded, clearly moved by the older man's words. "She's remarkable," he said. "Anyone who can't see that is blind." Richard turned to his daughter, and Emily saw tears in her father's eyes for the first time since the accident. He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I let them make you feel invisible. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you sooner. You are my pride and joy, and I should have made sure everyone knew that from the beginning." Emily felt her own tears flowing freely now, but they were cleansing tears, healing tears. For 3 years, she had carried the burden of believing herself to be a disappointment, a source of shame for her father. To learn that the opposite was true, that his silence had been born of uncertainty rather than embarrassment, felt like a rebirth. The orchestra, perhaps sensing that the moment called for music, began to play again. This time, other couples began to move onto the dance floor, though they kept a respectful distance from Marcus and Emily, as if recognizing that they were witnessing something sacred. Sophie appeared at the edge of the dance floor, having somehow escaped her designated area once again. She walked right up to Emily and Marcus, oblivious to the dramatic events that had just unfolded, and announced, "That was pretty. Can I dance too?" The innocent request broke the remaining tension in the room, drawing smiles from even the most hardened observers. Marcus lifted Sophie into his arms, and the three of them moved together in an impromptu waltz that was clumsy and joyful, and absolutely perfect. As the evening continued, something remarkable happened. One by one, people began to approach Emily. Not to offer pity or awkward condolences, but to actually talk to her. They asked about her education, her interests, her thoughts on current events. They treated her like an intelligent, accomplished woman, rather than a tragic figure to be pitied. Some of the approaches were clearly motivated by guilt or a desire to curry favor with Richard Morrison. But others seemed genuine, as if Marcus's simple act of kindness had somehow given people permission to see Emily as she really was rather than as they had assumed her to be. Margaret Whitfield, the same woman who had made cruel comments earlier in the evening, approached with obvious discomfort but also with what appeared to be genuine regret. "Emily," she said awkwardly, "I owe you an apology. I said some things tonight that were unworthy. You didn't deserve that, and I'm ashamed of myself." Emily studied the older woman's face, looking for signs of insincerity, but found only genuine remorse. "Thank you for saying that," she replied graciously. "It means more than you might think." Similar conversations happened throughout the remainder of the evening, each one helping to heal wounds that had been festering for years. Emily found herself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in months, engaging in the kind of social interaction she had thought was lost to her forever. Marcus continued to work, but he found reasons to pass by Emily's area frequently, checking on her and Sophie, who had become fast friends despite their age difference. There was an easy comfort between them now, a connection that transcended the unusual circumstances of their meeting. When the evening finally began to wind down, Richard Morrison made his way over to where Marcus was packing up his equipment. They spoke quietly for several minutes, and Emily watched from across the room as her father handed Marcus what appeared to be a business card. Later, as the last guests were saying their goodbyes and the orchestra was packing up their instruments, Marcus and Sophie approached Emily one final time. "We wanted to say goodbye," Marcus said, "and to thank you for making our evening so special." "Thank you for making mine magical," Emily replied, and meant every word. Sophie hugged Emily impulsively, the kind of spontaneous affection that only children can give. "Will we see you again?" she asked with the directness that had characterized all her interactions that evening. Emily looked at Marcus, uncertain how to answer. She wanted to say yes, desperately wanted to believe that this night was the beginning of something rather than just a beautiful aberration. But she had learned not to hope too hard for things that seemed too good to be true. "I hope so," she said carefully. Marcus smiled at her, the same warm expression that had started everything. "We will," he said with quiet certainty. "Your father invited us to dinner next Sunday. Sophie's already planning what she's going to wear." The revelation sent a shock of happiness through Emily's entire being. Not only would she see them again, but her father had taken the initiative to make it happen. The evening that had begun with such pain and isolation was ending with the promise of connection and possibly even friendship. As Marcus and Sophie walked away, Emily felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, genuine excitement about the future. For the first time since her accident, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow, curious about what it might bring. Richard Morrison watched his daughter's face as the Thompson family departed, and he saw something there that he had almost forgotten existed: hope. It was a fragile thing, This new light in Emily's eyes, but it was real, and it was beautiful, and it filled him with a determination to nurture it however he could. The grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel slowly emptied, the last of the evening's drama fading into memory. But the impact of what had happened would ripple outward for months and years to come, changing not just Emily's life but the lives of everyone who had witnessed it. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest acts of kindness. Sometimes courage looks like nothing more than a shy man asking a lonely woman to dance. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is see people, really see them, for who they are rather than what we assume them to be. As Emily Morrison left the hotel that night, she carried with her more than just the memory of a beautiful evening. She carried the knowledge that she was worthy of being seen, worthy of being valued, worthy of being loved. It was a gift more precious than any her father's money could buy. And it had come from the most unexpected source. The night everyone ignored the CEO's paralyzed daughter had become the night someone finally saw her for who she really was. And that made all the difference in the world.